Grasshopper Radio.
Right, good evening, lady and gentlemen. So, welcome to this question time. It's a small turnout, but that doesn't matter at all. The important thing is the dialogue and the opportunity to ask questions. So what's going to happen, I hope you've got some questions, otherwise it could be a very short evening indeed. The idea is that you get a chance to ask the panel about anything, really, and we've got no idea what's coming, so we will just answer to the best of our ability, and we'll rotate it around. And please, if you'd like to join in, please do so. Okay? Heckle, yeah. Whatever happens, we'll have a picture at the end. Hey! Woo. Now, Laura, you're welcome actually to stay in the audience if you want. Or likewise, you're welcome to join up here, whatever you prefer to do. What would you like to do next?
Depends on the type of questions, because I don't know how,
well, they're only asking nice questions.
Well, to be honest, with the small size of the audience we've got, it's going to be much more discursive anyway. So feel free to sit up there, and if you feel passionately, we might sometimes bring you in first.
BNP though.
I'm not BNP.
He's not BNP. Okay, so I wonder if someone would like to kick off and ask us the first question, and we'll put that round the panel. Hector, thank you.
Do you think Theresa May should resign after Brexit, as she said, or should she carry on after?
Okay, so should Theresa May go on after the successful conclusion of the Brexit negotiations? Successful. Thank you. Mr. Mars, would you like to start on that?
Well, on what basis are you asking that she should resign? Because
she said that she will step down after the Brexit negotiations. Do you feel that that's the right thing to do? Do you feel she should carry on after Brexit, or just go after she's done Brexit?
I don't really know why she said that to start with. Secondly, I think she's been in an incredibly difficult position, given that she was a Remainer anyway. So I think it's likely to be more a question of she'll be gone for other reasons anyway. So I feel like I'm maybe dodging the question a bit there, but whether she should, I don't know. If every politician who should resign, there wouldn't be many people sitting in the House, I don't think. And what I don't like is the culture of people towing the party line all the time, and I think it's the problem of the media always basically trying to catch people out. So what we end up with is very few people who are actually prepared to say what they actually think about something. And I'm so bored of listening to politicians on the media just trotting out, being on message. And so I'd rather, that's one of the refreshing things about Jeremy Corbyn is that he's a conviction politician, and so I don't think people should be caught out saying, you said this, you said that. I think I'd rather sort of judge people on their convictions and their actions and what they deliver. And why make up your mind sort of before the event? No, I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen with Brexit, how it's going to work out, when it's going to work out, etc. So hopefully, without dodging your question, I'm sort of I won't dodge your question. I'll say no, I don't think she should particularly. That's my view.
Mr. Dole?
It seems to me that it's very hard to hold old ways of accountability now that Brexit has happened. To figure out, and lots of bigger things. So you're young, you don't remember what it was like before, before the financial crash of 2008. This kind of thrown everything in terms of the economy. And to some extent, the consequence of that in terms of national identity for Britain, whether inside or outside the EU, whether Scotland is going to be joined to the UK or not, all those issues have bubbled up. And they never were issues, really serious issues, the way that those issues have become serious in the last 10 years or so. So I just hesitate to say shoulds because a little bit the rule book about shoulds has kind of been crumpled up and thrown out the window. I mean, she shouldn't be Prime Minister if you go by the way things have gone over the last couple of years. Certainly since she's become Prime Minister, she's made big mistakes that would have seen her out the door in any other circumstance. But in the crisis of Brexit, she's here, and I assume she's going to stay. There's always one thing that remains the same: is political intriguing inside the parties, whether it's the Labour Party or the Tory Party, and that might see the end of her. That political intrigue, people, other leaders trying to shove her out, but I don't think she's necessarily. She doesn't seem to suffer from the shame of what's happened that would, in normal circumstances, make her resign. So she's probably going to stay.
I think your question was about May rather than about Brexit, so I'm going to park my views on Brexit to one side and just talk about May. I think there are two very interesting precedents that we might think about. The first is very recent, and that is Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, when he became leader of the Labour Party, had the opportunity to call a snap general election, and it was generally felt that Brown was doing very well in the early days, and he took the decision not to call that snap election. And having not called the snap election, his world completely fell apart. He then lost a general election in the sense that Labour lost its majority. But this isn't much remembered now, but there was a prospect in 2010 that Brown could have just about clung on to power by putting a coalition together. It's an interesting parallel with May, because people always criticise Brown for not holding that snap general election. There was no pressure on May to hold a snap general election, none whatsoever. The narrative that the British people were presented with in 2017 was that having an election would strengthen Britain's negotiation prospects with the EU. So we had an election that we didn't technically need on any ground at all. The government had a majority already, but the government was slightly running scared of its critics in its own ranks and the critics in the House of Lords. So May goes on a walking holiday, she comes back, she's looking at 20% opinion poll leads, she calls a general election, turns out she's totally incapable of running a proper election campaign, and her world too falls to bits. So it's an interesting thing there about history that on the one hand you're seeing a parallel, but whatever decision Gordon Brown did or didn't take, or May didn't take, history's often got unintended consequences. The second precedent is much older. Let's have a think. Can we think of another example in history where a Prime Minister went to the country not needing to on a particular issue and lost their majority? And the only obvious one I can think of at all is Stanley Baldwin on the question of imperial protection in the 1920s. That's the only one I can really think about at all. And Baldwin is briefly out of office and then returns and becomes one of the leading politicians of the 1930s. The answer is, should May go? Should May go on credibility? Yes. Should May go on her genuine popularity within Conservative Party ranks? Probably not, only on the basis that they fear all of the alternatives. But in the end, the British people should have to say, of course, not May and not the Conservative Party. But might be.
What do you think?
Well, if she said she's going to go, I think if she feels that's the right thing to do, considering her simply awful election campaign, which has led to the loss of her majority, if she feels that that's what she's got to do, then yeah, do that, because if you feel that's right, you do it.
But haven't we seen in May in so many times that she's backtracked on what she said? There is absolutely no 100% certainty she's going to go and she's going to stick with her word, because frankly she's never stuck with her word. So I don't think, unless she gets kicked out, I don't think she'll go herself.
Even so, if we're going to talk about if Brexit doesn't go as well as we can, we've got the 2-year transition period brings us to 2021, which is when the next election would be held. So she's going to go after Brexit either way, either in the transition period or after the negotiations are done.
I think there is a chaos to the government now. You take the most recent thing, I can't remember the exact date, it's the 29th of March that we're due to leave the EU, but suddenly to say we're going to leave
11 o'clock.
11 o'clock. I mean, that's a kind of madness, a chaos of a government in deep distress. So it's perfectly feasible the government could collapse long before 2019.
Do you think that if the EU is going to threaten us with a bad deal, we should pick no deal at all over a potentially horrific one?
That's what James Dyson said, wasn't it? I think he said that the other day, that we should just call their bluff and leave, because they, it's
they
a two-way
essentially
street.
need us, like Germany, they export to us.
Exactly.
France, they sell everything to us that they pretty much make. So I think that they perhaps would be in a worse scenario if they did end up screwing us over and giving us no trade deal and stop trading with us at all. So I think maybe we should go with no deal if there is a problem. I just want to hear your perspective on it.
So that's our second question, I think, then. Is no deal better than deal?
Yeah.
Mr. O'Donnell, do you want to first?
Good question. I think my default position about the whole thing is if it's a disaster, it's a limited disaster from British point of view. We are the biggest city by far, the biggest population metro district in Europe by far, the biggest deregulated economy in Europe, where there's not a significant amount of state ownership or interference in the free market, which is very attractive to the Germans and the French, and they own lots of British, as you probably know, institutions and infrastructure. That's not going to change a beam, probably, significantly. So it's certainly a plausible choice. And our country will find a way to survive, and it's not. One of the tragedies, I've said this before, the tragedies of Brexit isn't necessarily for Britain, it's a tragedy for Europe. That this robust, strong state that can spread the weight of the European experiment on the shoulders of more than just one or two states is now going to be removed, and that sets a jeopardy for Britain, for Europe. Should we? Well, it's hard to say should when my heart lies in a different direction all the way. But I take it as you have to remember it's a negotiation, and if you're a fierce negotiator and you're advocating for your side, if you're a lawyer, some of you will grow up to be lawyers arguing in a court, you don't sympathize with the other side. It's not that's not your job. Your job isn't to see them as reasonable, possible, oh yeah, you're right. You don't say that in front of the judge. You say, oh yeah, I see your point. Yeah, maybe I'm wrong. You come in with a firm, extreme point, and you push it, and you negotiate it, and you negotiate it when you have to, and you play your hand when you have to. And unfortunately or fortunately, in the current world politic in Europe, it's a poker game. So that's what Theresa May is playing, and she knows it. It's not unusual, because that's often how international negotiations take place.
I think it depends what's going on. There's so many subplots going on with what Angela Merkel's weakened position in Germany since they invited a million immigrants into the country. Macron is having a tough time in France at the moment. He was the new wonder kid on the block like 6 months ago, whatever it was. And today I saw a headline saying that there's a possibility of sort of 10,000 jobs could leave London and go to Paris. And if he's suffering and other people are suffering, then little subplots like that might come into play as well. Depends when they've just had an election in Germany, and Merkel really suffered as a result. I think largely down to her stance on Brexit.
And those subplots are as much UK subplots. So unfortunately, there are a small number of crazed Brexiteers who just want the thing pure, as though Brexit is like some drug. They want the very purest form of it, and they would go to the cliff edge, and they would cheerfully jump off the cliff edge and have no deal, because this fair land will prosper beyond the cliff, whatever. Now, I think Mr O'Donnell is absolutely right. There's an awful lot of reason still to be optimistic about Britain, and particularly the country that it's become, I would say, since the 1970s. This country's shifted enormously, culturally, in terms of our values. Brexit may be regrettable in terms of a kind of breakup with the European family, but one hopes that cordial relations will continue beyond that. And my suspicion is there will be a deal in the end. I think it will be brinkmanship. It'll go to the absolute wire. There may be just a scenario that there's some kind of crazy thing happens, like there's a 2-day period in between or something like that. But I think fundamentally, both sides, in the end, have simply too much to lose. But there are so many banana skins along the way, political in the UK and political subplots in Europe, as Mr. Meyer says.
And don't forget, there's lions on the outside of the fire going around, but there's the Russians. Russia's fantastic, right? Has all sorts of great potential, but it's also it seems to be covetous or at least interested in meddling in the European experiment and in what Brexit is going to lead to for Europe, because they have huge resources to come in to the rescue if needs be, and to look like a pair, to appear like they're going to, for some states, especially in Eastern Europe, solve problems, whether it's through fuel or it's through other resources. So don't forget that one of the banana skins can be other states who maybe resent Europe.
But I do think the Boeing's stance on the Bombardier in Ireland, and America's so protectionist about its jobs and its business dealings that people say that's got nothing to do with Brexit, but when I listen to the pro-Brexiteers talking about there's a brave new world of all the fantastic trade deals that they can do around the world, that seemed like that didn't fill me with hope hearing that. They just sort of put the tariffs on anything coming from Europe going that way towards America. They put the tariffs so high that it just basically blew the Bombardier out of the water. And then that's potentially putting 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 jobs at stake, and then so therefore that becomes like a local problem for politicians in this country. So they can't necessarily always speak how they actually feel about it, because they've just got too many balls in the air that they're juggling.
Yeah, we can take some points from the audience now. That would be great. Joe and then Christoph.
A third question.
We'll come to your third question in a second. And we just finished this issue then, which is deal or no deal on Brexit. So, Christoph.
I was just wondering, how you've changed the European Union. Now Britain's leaving, but the European idea is basically that countries who rely economically on each other don't go over in war. I think that's a good idea. So now that the UK is leaving the European Union, obviously it's not the best option. But if you have the possibility, how would you form the European Union today? What changes would you make to the current system?
Well, everyone talks about the Norwegian model, the Swiss model, but I don't think those countries, they're just not comparable with the UK. It's difficult to sort of try and take up a position of something that I don't particularly believe in, so I'm struggling to, I think it's sort of okay, even just little everyday things, just like whether you have a hard or a soft border in Ireland, go from Northern Ireland to Southern Ireland. I think there are so many, I find it mind-boggling to try and understand the complexities and implications of Brexit, because there's so many little things, I think, that nobody's thought of that will affect untold millions of people in just how they run their everyday life, just going 2 miles across the border into Southern Ireland, as you've done for the last 30 years, and things like that just make it's a dog's dinner, as far as I'm concerned, in every way.
I think it's very difficult to reform the EU. It's labyrinthine. And a lot of that comment comes from critics of the EU, obviously within Britain. But of course the truth is, it's actually very difficult to reform any institution. Tony Blair took on the reform of the House of Lords. And we ended up with one of the most ridiculous compromises ever seen, that 91 hereditary peers in the House of Lords remain, and they're elected just by the hereditary peers. The House of Lords reform then stalled. One might say the American Constitution has got its flaws. These things are written at moments in history. They're created at moments in history. The EU is absolutely a product of the post-war world and the Cold War world. That's its culture. It then grew in a way I don't think really its founding fathers could have ever believed following the collapse of communism. It's a staggering success story, and that's been part of its problem. You wouldn't invent the EU in the way it is today if you could start all over again, just like you wouldn't invent the United Nations in the way it is today if you could start all over again. But reforming these institutions is an incredibly difficult process.
Just to pick up on that point, we think, especially when we're young, we think that there's an ideal of how things should be, right? An ideal of justice and fairness that should exist. And that's really rare. At any kind of macro level, that's really rare. And the places where you have institutions that have existed for a long time, just the fact that they've existed for a long time, with all their flaws, right? Whether it's the British Constitution or the US Constitution or the EU. Yeah, it's the fact that it has existed that gives it legitimacy. And so if people want to come in with something new or radically change it, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, a radical change of the Russian state that was successful, perhaps rarely successful in terms of its radical change, and you can judge it on the degrees to which it was successful. But I would argue that's rare. What people value is the longevity and the legitimacy that an institution has with all its flaws, because that gives you a base from which to derive your justification. So if you say, like, the EU is flawed, well, it has existed, it's been approved, it has a democratic route to it, and therefore it has some legitimacy rather than me just saying, or somebody coming in from the outside saying, this is better. Well, okay, based on what? Where's your longevity? Where's your proof in the pudding? The fact that things exist and the rule of law and the respect for human rights has existed and developed within that institution justifies it, with all its flaws. And of course, as Sir points out, it's very difficult to change that. But it's weird when I heard you ask the question, I thought, gosh, no one's even discussed this anymore for the last year. No one's even talked about reforming the EU because it's a lost cause from a British point of view. We think about Brexit, what's it going to be like for us? But it just dawned on me the other day, yesterday, the day before, there's an alternative reality that could have happened, a year and a bit ago, where there was a reformed EU, and the British accepted that reformed EU. David Cameron was successful, he's currently our Prime Minister, but he's not, because it didn't work, and that reform, whatever it was intended to be, nobody really embraced, I suppose, from either side. Certainly the British didn't accept it, and the compromise offered was seen as maybe unacceptable.
But we still got curvy bananas. Yeah. It was a myth. It hasn't changed.
Yeah. Well, good point. I think one could say, from the British perspective, the first fake news was about the EU. It was a stock in trade with the British press for decades.
Yes.
Well, it's remained until the £350 million a week going back into the NHS.
Indeed. Now, I'm sorry to cut you shortly, but I know Joe has got the next question for us.
Recently, Labour has had a big push to get votes at 16. Do you believe votes at 16?
I'll start this time. So this is votes at 16, whether that's a good idea. Okay, I must say, over the years, I've been all over the place on this question. I really have. I have changed my view on it. Where I am now, particularly post-Brexit, with the reanimation of young people, I think it is actually a good idea. There's a caveat that I would have, and I've written actually to Parliament about this, and they've actually published my paper, which I'm delighted about. But what I would say is this: absolutely, but only if there is a commitment in UK education that the quality of citizenship education is improved. Because there is no point in a tokenistic move to give 16-year-olds the vote without a dramatic and determined effort to ensure that the quality of knowledge about the political system in the UK is improved in British schools. If that can be done, then I would wholeheartedly support it. And again, I'd make that point about Brexit, but the unfortunate thing about it, and don't get me wrong, Everyone has the right to vote. It doesn't matter if it's the last time you vote in your life. Everyone has earned that right to vote. So we must not blame the elderly for Brexit. Many elderly people did not vote for Brexit. Many did. But that's entirely right in their democratic choice. But the unfortunate thing about a vote like Brexit, and this is what so infuriated many young people, is that you can't undo it easily. You can chuck out a government in 5 years' time, but you can't undo a referendum result so easily. Paradoxically, you can if the referendum isn't won. So I guarantee if it had been a 52-48 split to remain, that the Brexiteers would have said, we're close and it's just a matter of the next time. That's not, unfortunately, an option given to the Remainers who lost. But yeah, I think this is the moment to be serious about dropping the vote to 16.
I think the issue with that is that, I mean, for example, it would suit different parties, it would suit the Labour Party better to have more younger people voting, is the general consensus. I actually, putting that to one side, I think it's more a question, I think there should be a sort of unified age for most things about becoming a grown-up. It's like, if you can take a bullet for your country, then you should be able to vote. But I don't think it should be one or t'other. It's like, if you can get married, you can, or you're paying tax. I don't know if there should be an implication if you're not paying tax, then whether you should have a vote or not. But so I think there should. I'm more in favour of a unified age for everything. It's like when you become an adult, and then that's when you can get married. That's when you can pay tax. That's when you can go to war for your country, whatever it is. On whether you are ready and mature enough and wise enough, and I suspect you guys are, but the one thing I think back to is when, as soon as I, almost sort of a few weeks after my 18th birthday, I was called up for jury service, and I was, I don't think I should have been. I don't think I was worldly wise enough to sit in a court of law and make a decision over whether someone was going to end up losing their freedom and going to jail. And when I was in the jury room along with guys who were twice my age, 3 times my age, and I didn't really have a voice, I didn't feel strong enough to sort of pipe up and talk about it, and I don't feel I'd have had enough life experience by then. And so, and it's sort of bothered me ever since that I don't feel that I really, not sure that justice was done from my point of view, because I didn't pipe up, and in fact, I think I might have done, and I think that it ended up going. They were convicted, and they went down 10 to 2 in the jury, and it just bothered me that I wasn't really old enough to make that decision. When that is, I don't know. So maybe 25 or something like that. So it's difficult again. You should certainly be able to vote by the time you're 25. But I would say when you can take a bullet for your country, that's when you can have a say in whether your government decides whether you should go to war or not in the first place.
I'm no real firm views on the subject. Just it's interesting. We have a certain age when you can drive, a certain age when you can vote, a certain age when you can serve in the military. When you get married, and those seem to go. It's about, are you ready? But unfortunately, there has to be a line that the government passes about, are you ready or not? I'm not sure if a 16-year-old is ready.
Well, maybe we need to introduce a citizenship test for UK citizens as well. So
you can only vote
seeking citizenship
75% or above.
To take it back to Brexit very briefly, I was annoyed when I saw the ballot paper for the Brexit referendum because it did not have an option for no, but not under these terms. Do you think, given that third option, there would have been a slight more sway towards there rather than perhaps the definitive yes-no argument?
I think it just exponentially confuses and muddies the waters, because to me the whole problem with Brexit is a binary question. Yes, no, black and white, for an unbelievably complex question, and so therefore just adding another option, I think, would just make it even harder to kind of decipher who voted what and why they did. I think that the fundamental problem with referendums is the wording of the question in the first place, Because I didn't want to vote for either of them, but I don't know that the third option that you're suggesting would have been any more appealing to me either. Because I was sort of 40% in that one, 40% in that one, and a bit in the middle, 20% in the middle. Does that add up to 100?
Yeah.
Just really quick while we are back at Brexit. As an overseas student from Europe, I find it quite interesting if you would in 5 years look at the outcome of Brexit, like if it would have a good outcome, if Britain would take profit from Brexit, don't you think that other countries in Europe take that as an example and leave Europe as well? And if the outcome would be bad, that they would stay in Europe and the European Union?
I think there's a danger of that. I mean, firstly, how are you going to determine what's a good outcome? At what point? That's the other thing, I don't understand at which point some politician is going to be able to say to me, there you go, I told you so, it was a right idea. Because, you know, most politicians are sort of short-termists, they're there for 5 years or 10 years, and they're not there to sort of pick up the pieces in 30 years' time. And but also, I simply don't understand the measure of when it's going to be provable that it was a good Brexit or not. But I do think there does seem to be a general rise of nationalism across lots of countries, and all those countries wanting their country back. I feel and hope it's not a massive kind of fascist rise of the far-right-wing countries, but it is there. I think it gives an opportunity for people to jump on that bandwagon, definitely.
I'd make an observation about the school and going all IB. Right? I wonder where this is going, but there is a kind of interesting parallel. It's very difficult always to measure these impacts of decisions, and the thing I'd say is almost certainly inevitable, unless Brexit is a massive success or a total failure. What's going to happen economically is that some areas of the economy, some sectors will prosper and others will suffer, just as that would have been true if we'd have stayed in. I'm now beginning to realise how Theresa May felt, so signs kept falling off. The signs is incapable of standing up. There'll be the middle way. There'll be successes, there'll be failures. But my beef with the whole debate in the first place is that the debate in the UK never got beyond, really, money and trade. And that's not the sole thing that the EU project was about. We know from our own local UKIP politician who said Britain leaves and it's the first brick goes from the rotten structure. There are an awful lot of wreckers in the Brexiteer movement who would welcome the breakup of the EU, and it seems to me, okay, that could happen. I'm not sure personally I think that is a good thing. I think it's very destabilising at a time when things are already unstable. To be fair though, part of the reason we've gotten this mess is that the political elites have been too complacent about the compliance of their own peoples. And that's not just a British question, that's right the way across Europe. And that's one of the reasons why the people are in backlash about being taken for granted. It'll be interesting to see what a even semi-successful British Brexit means for the deeper structure.
Yeah, I think it's just a risk, whatever the case, all the memberships, the states that are members of the European Union, because of the example. And even if it's not going to be a disaster. I can't imagine in any way it's going to be a big disaster, because at the end of the day, Britain was in many ways a reluctant late joiner, even though it's been part of our constitution for over 40 years, and it's thrived in many ways, but there's other reasons and there are other factors behind that growth and that thriving of Britain. So Britain will be able to remove itself, as I said at the beginning, I think relatively successful with or without a big deal. As Sir said, there's going to be people who profit and people who lose. But that could be mistakenly interpreted as other states, like Eastern European states or states that have been in financial difficulty as maybe a way out of their problems. That's just danger. But I have to wait and see.
Just one thing very briefly, what I never got about the whole thing is why it's the number one issue. Why the EU is the number one most critical issue that faces the country. I've never understood that. And people have an obsession with it, which is equivalent to kind of finding reds under the bed or something like that. And whether it's a scapegoating thing, that it suits us to say our problems are someone else's fault, but whether it's homelessness, inequalities of education, health, postcode lottery, there are umpteen things, I would argue, more fundamental, more important for the political classes to be talking about and occupying their time about than this particular issue.
And to Labour's credit, that was their message often, that there are other bigger issues. Let's not get sidetracked and spend years only talking about Brexit when Sir's raised that there are other issues that we need to concern ourselves with.
We've seen consistently with the party in charge of the UK government that we keep swinging between centre-left, centre-right, and centre-left and centre-right. And do you think that, because we're currently sort of centre-right-ish at the moment, do you think that as we sort of swing back for the left in the next 20, 30 years, that there'll be a greater sort of willingness to cooperate with the EU countries, and we could see the emergence of a rejoin movement in 20 to 30 years and see greater sort of public willingness to go back to the EU?
Well, maybe it's more young people who have become voters. Maybe that will lend it some weight.
Yeah.
I mean,
we talk about a bunch of middle-aged men who, mental fatigue of the notion of that happening. But of course. Yeah.
Also, I mean, should you say? I mean, is there a definite thing? It's moving back to the centre left.
It's not sort of a simplistic trend, but we've seen, predicted. Because if you've seen, because 1990s was predominantly Labour dominated, if I've got my facts correct, and then
New Labour.
New Labour. Sorry, I'm not spraying it correctly. And then consistently towards the start of the new millennium, we've sort of gone back to the Conservative ever since the Blair and Brown administrations. And the whole fallout from the Iraq War sort of tarnished the Labour Party. But then before that, it was the Thatcher era, which sort of galvanised people to support the Conservative Party back in the 1970s and 80s, until support finally waned and allowed New Labour to come in and take a position. So what could happen, we're starting to see it now in effect. There's a much greater degree of support, in my opinion, amongst sort of certainly the under 30 age group for Labour, purely because Jeremy Corbyn in particular has branded himself as being down with the kids, inverted commas, to put it one way. Whereas Theresa May has slightly distanced herself. There was the Lord Mayor's banquet a couple of days ago, whilst Jeremy Corbyn appeared on Gogglebox, I think was it about a fortnight ago. So if it will all slightly, the next 10 years will be a pivotal point in British politics, because we're going to see the emergence of the modern youth as a quite a formidable force in politics. And one of the points of my question was to try and see whether you had any sort of predictions as to what the modern youth's influence might have on the EU issue.
Well, I think the answer I would say to that is that, well, you need to get out and vote for a start. And I think there's a feeling that for the first time in a long time that the youth are starting to engage with politics again and realise that actually it does affect you, and if you don't get out and vote, then you can't moan about it. And I think the other problem is that there's all the shy Tories that the people that when it comes to it they won't admit to it in public, but then when they get in that booth and then a pen hovers over the box and they end up voting, because the fact is that if Corbyn doesn't win the next election, then Labour have lost, that's the fourth in a row, and so therefore I think his position would be untenable. And how could he defend, well, let me have a go for a fifth election, see if we can get elected the fifth time. So I think he'd have a problem. So yeah, I think you're probably right, it is maybe shifting that way, but will you still be feeling that strongly? You've got to remember that because will you be voting next time?
If there's not another snap, then yes.
Yes,
So will pretty much everyone in this
Right.
room. Well, yes, pretty much everyone in this room, age-wise anyway.
No, it's fine. When you were, it was about a new Brexit. Oh, sorry,
it was,
a new Europe.
it was about politics and the whether or not a return to the centre left is
Yeah.
likely.
And also if that might manifest itself in
In a rejoin.
a rejoin. I think my gut instinct is that politics moves quickly and institutions change, and I can't imagine whatever the future holds. It probably doesn't hold Britain in the European Union, but Britain in a new relationship with Europe.
I think it's quite interesting. Just in the last week, Peter Kellner, who's brilliant on UK elections, said that he's never known a period in British politics like that. And this is a knowledge of kind of 45 years of British electioneering. You say a return of the centre left. What I thought was unthinkable was a return of the far left. It is no longer unthinkable. People said Trump could not be elected. People said Brexit couldn't happen. Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister with a Marxist Chancellor, it's perfectly possible. And it need not be 5 years, it could be 6 months and a year. That's how volatile politics is. The reason the answer is so complicated, if I cut it to the quick, what's interesting, if you went back to 2010, what was striking is the shrinkage of support for the mainstream political parties. The growth of the other, whether it was the SNP or whatever it was. There has now been a bit of a backlash against that in 2017. Actually, 2017 turned out to be quite a good election for Labour and the Conservative combined. It seems like a return to two-party politics. But whether that's sustained is too difficult to tell. The damage that the Conservatives' electoral fiasco had, whether Corbyn can actually hang on. If he loses, he's definitely finished. Surely if he loses a second election, it's that volatile. The UK seems to be crying out for a Macron.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
But you know what? The parties in Britain are dogged survivors. Everyone talks about new parties being formed in Britain. It seems fiendishly difficult to do. Rupert, you had a question too?
Sorry?
Rupert, you also had a question.
I did have a question.
Can we come back to you? Because I don't think you've asked anything yet, have you, Rupert?
Well, I was wondering about Conservatives who were traitors in inverted commas. Whether you think that people like that should probably resign as going against what the people kind of voted them in for. In situations
But my reaction to that, when I heard about it, was very recently being called that, right? The last day or two of the papers calling it traitors. Is that this is a battle. This is the battle. It's an internal battle for the Tories, right? They got to decide if they're going to be the old Tories, nationalists, more right wing, or are they going to be the Tories of the centre ground Tories? And so this is where the battle, and it's over this issue, as much as anything else. And if they're going to give up and walk away, that's the end. Think of the Bolshevik Revolution. If you're going to disagree with the Bolsheviks and stand up and walk out, you leave the Bolsheviks to make all the decisions. So if you're going to stand up and walk out and leave the right-wing Tories to make all the decisions, that's going to be the party for the next generation. So this is the soul of the Tory party, I think, being fought over at the moment. That's my interpretation, anyway.
Do you not think that some of the more, when a lot of people talk about the government, they say that they're too indecisive? Do you not think that the government should be a bit less scared of what people are going to think and just do things when they're in their term, and actually sometimes...
It's tricky with the lack of majority though, isn't it? That's the problem. That's the fundamental problem that she's got. It's difficult to be really decisive if you're sacking 2 ministers a week.
I feel very strongly about this. The Telegraph on this particular issue has been completely scurrilous. Those people are not proposing to block Britain's Brexit. They're not. They have a series of technical issues about the way in which the Brexit legislation goes through. That is not treachery. But that's the Telegraph just being mischievous. What was outrageous, totally outrageous, is when the Daily Mail accused the judges of being enemies of the people. That is the language, no, quite seriously, that is the language of the Nazis. That is the language that is dangerous, it's inflammatory. The Mail is a paper that you should never buy unless you intend to burn it, because it is a rag. We know as a school, we've experienced this at first glance, its journalists operate below a decent values criteria, and that kind of journalism is incredibly dangerous because it misrepresented the issues the judges were dealing with. And I have to say, the government's performance on that was feeble, initially at least. What they should have done is to say that is poor journalism, and that's where politicians running scared of the press is appalling.
Well, they do run scared of the press.
For sure.
Yeah.
You know, the
Yeah.
first person that Blair went to see when he became leader of the
Yeah.
Labour Party was Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah. But I totally get that. But my point is there's a limit, surely, even for politicians chasing votes and wanting to curry favour with the media. Most reasonable people looking at that newspaper headline, seeing enemies of the people for our independent judiciary, is such a distortion of the truth that almost you could say those journalists need themselves to be brought before the dock to account for their actions.
Just to conclude on that idea, there's very little noble behaviour in Parliament, and hopefully the more you study it, the more you see that. So the idea of a good leader who's going to make decisions and execute those decisions is rare. Happens in wartime, and when the country's in existential crisis, and otherwise you don't really see it.
Maybe we need a government of national unity.
Yeah.
Maybe we need a war.
Or a war. Are there any other questions? Because I know before I bring Luke back in, is anyone else would like to raise a point about this issue, or are we happy to move on to another one? Yeah? Okay, so if I can come back to Hector.
Should I just go get some?
Hector, did you have a...
You said that we should sort out different problems apart from the Brexit EU. Well, surely in the situation we're in now, doesn't Brexit depend? Don't our own problems depend on how Brexit goes? Do you think keep an eye on them, and if they go catastrophe, if they become a catastrophe, we sort out that? But do you think if it's not becoming a catastrophe, a complete catastrophe, we should keep focusing on the negotiations? Because they're the ones that are going to impact what we do afterwards, like the NHS and things like that.
Well, pro-Brexiteers would argue that it's the fundamental business of being in Europe is getting in the way of us attending to all the other problems, which is a reasonable argument from their point of view.
My own view is that that's just a complete fig leaf. I don't see how the EU stops Britain being able to tackle its problems. And just to give you something rather amusing that happened, and some of you may have been in the audience and remember it. So the day after we voted Brexit, we had Mike Baker in here speaking to Year 9. Now normally, with a visiting speaker, I would be very respectful, and I started off being very respectful, but I got more and more irritated and more hot-headed because the arguments put forward are ludicrous. So he will say, we want to take back control of sovereignty. So I say, okay, can you just confirm with me, how far do we take that? Do we get rid then of the unelected House of Lords? No. Do we get rid of our sovereign so that we can genuinely take back power ourselves in a republic? Oh no. So the narrative that's presented of taking back control is extremely narrow. But to come back to your question, what I meant was that the issues that face Britain, if you look at the government now, what would Theresa May's government actually be doing if it wasn't doing Brexit? Because that seems to be all we're doing day to day. It's all we're talking about day to day. There are really serious problems still in Britain that governments need to deal with. And Brexit's been a distraction, in my view, from dealing with those. Whether it's social inequality, whether it's the massive problems that the health service has got, from the impact of austerity, these are things that politicians should be exercised about, not the issue of the European Union. Of course it matters, but it's not in my top 5. That's purely the point that I made. Was trying to make. Should we take all of them? But we're starting to run out of time, so we'll get through as many people as we can. Christoph.
So I had a question about Trident. So I once went to Hiroshima and met someone who survived the drop of the atomic bomb, and I was wondering. So I pursue, I see the atomic bomb as being an act of terror, of pure terrorism, because it is not there for any tactical reason. It's just for terrorizing any human being on the planet. And I was just wondering what you think about Trident, if the UK should spend so many billions on renewing this program, if it's just there for terrorizing the public, if it is being used.
I think it comes down to parity with, if someone else has got it, then kind of we have to have it. It's that's the problem.
It doesn't make you any better than the other side, does it?
Say again?
I mean, that doesn't make you better than the other side, though, because you've got this weapon of terror.
No, but the reason we're the reason we're taking North Korea seriously is because of their threat of having the weapon. As soon as he can put a nuclear warhead on a missile that's capable of reaching America, maybe you'll think this is alarmist. It kind of wouldn't surprise me if I woke up one morning and the first thing I heard on the news is that Trump has dropped what they would call a small tactical missile. He's talked about it, on Pyongyang, and taking out, as they say, Kim Jong-un, but taking out however many million, not even just North Koreans, not that I have any beef with them, but lots of South Koreans as well. And I think it's an unfortunate situation, but I think it's tricky for Jeremy Corbyn because he's anti it, but he had a really tricky question. It comes back to the one we said at the beginning about whether you should or shouldn't do something. He was put in an impossible position as to say, would you press the button? And he kind of couldn't say yes or, well, he said, no, I wouldn't, but then what does he actually do about our, renewing Trident and spending all that money? So I think, in the old arms race 30 years ago, when we had enough nuclear weapons to sort of blow ourselves up 10,000 times over, MAD, it was known as mutually assured destruction, and then the gradual negotiation was to reduce it so we could only blow ourselves up 5,000 times and so on. So I think that's the problem. If someone's got it, we talk to them because you have to talk to them, and so the only way to solve it is to just get rid of all of them. You have some, and then everyone has them, or nobody. I feel, this was the last thing, I do slightly feel that who are we to say to someone else they can't have nuclear weapons? We can have them, but you can't. I wish they didn't exist, but if the baddies have got them, then we've got to have them. That's kind of how I feel.
I think we should work more vehemently toward an international nuclear arms elimination deal and try to bring them down. So like most things in history, I speak as a history teacher, as long as it's taken to get bad, it usually takes that long to get better or to recover from. And the problem of nuclear weapons in the world exists. You can justify it from the chess game of liberty, and the liberty is guaranteed by the vigilance and the price and the blood often of people willing to fight to defend it. And sometimes that involves horrible things like possibly even nuclear weapons. I think I can understand that there's a continuum of viciousness that winds up with nuclear weapons. So it's not excluded. I don't know if I accept your point that it's somehow, just because it's a nuclear weapon, makes it other than the viciousness that people, the Americans destroyed Tokyo, killed 100,000 people in Tokyo just with normal bombing. The nuclear weapons only killed half that many in the cities that they were dropped on. So certainly it's a huge weapon, and it's terrible, and we should work to get rid of it. I think my gut instinct is we shouldn't bother spending the excessive amount to pursue or renew it. We should spend those amounts of money to trying to negotiate reductions and eliminations. but you can't if people don't want to negotiate.
So 2018 will be the anniversary of the 1958 Aldermaston March, which was against the British nuclear weapons programme. Of course, it's the Greshamian Gerald Holton who designs the symbol, the peace symbol for that march. And therefore, that's slightly colouring my view here. I read a very funny article in the summer saying that the only country in the world which had an identical nuclear weapons policy to the Great Britain is North Korea. What? Well, think about it. The logic of Britain's possession of nuclear weapons is this. Britain has a very small number of nuclear weapons that it could fire. Britain's calculation, therefore, is that no one will mess with it on the assumption that even if a greater power could do much greater destruction, Britain can do some destruction. That is exactly North Korea's calculation too. Learning the lesson from Colonel Gaddafi's fate in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the West will mess with you if you don't have nuclear weapons. If you've got them, the West will take stock. And I'm actually long been of Mr. Meyer's persuasion that the idea of non-nuclear proliferation is an odd one, and it's actually in some ways fundamentally still quite racist, that there is a kind of Western intelligent set of nations who knows how to use this in massively destructive technology well and reasonably, and there are others who don't. Now, I'm no apologist for North Korea. I want to make that absolutely clear. It's a hideous regime, and I shall rejoice the day that that regime is gone, rather as I will rejoice if it turns out that Mugabe is going. Not quite a like for like, but there's another dictator who history will be glad to see the back of. But I think the logic of renewing Trident is very, very questionable, to come back to the original question.